So I've been thinking about a particular topic for quite a while now. I'd actually go so far as to say that this idea has been sitting in both the back and the front of my mind at various points throughout my entire career in vet. Every time that I've found myself involved in any kind of conversation about assessment, about engagement, um, compliance, non compliance, professional development, educational leadership, all the kinds of things that I generally talk about in my professional capacity. I find myself circling back to the same question. What if many of the problems that we're trying to solve aren't actually the problem? What if they're the symptoms? Because the longer that I spend in this sector, the more I think that many, if not most, of the challenges that we face stem from something that's far deeper than assessment tools, validation processes, resources, and to be honest, even regulation. I honestly think we have a sector-wide educational capability problem. Now, before anyone starts sharpening their pitchforks, let me clarify what I mean. When I entered the vet sector, I brought with me a teaching background. I have 2 education degrees. I spent 4 years at university studying purely education. Before I, stepped foot in an RTO, I worked as a teacher. Essentially, my entire professional preparation centered on understanding how people learn, how curriculum is designed, how assessment works, how knowledge and skills develop, and how educators facilitate and support that process. Now, what surprised me when I entered vet wasn't that training looked different from the experience I'd had in schools, because I expected that. What surprised me was just how often educational expertise seemed to be viewed as something that needed to be justified. I was absolutely looked down upon because of my teaching background. And I lost count very quickly of the number of times that I heard some version of, yeah, you're just a teacher though, training's different. Now, the funny thing is, I actually agree. Training is different. The problem is, I don't think it's different for the reasons that many people think it is. Because when I hear people say that training is different, what often seems to follow is the assumption that educational principles somehow don't apply here. That because we're teaching adults, we don't need to think as deeply about learning. That because we are training for competency, we don't need to think as deeply about curriculum design. That because we're focused on workplace outcomes, we don't need to think as deeply about assessment design. And I've never been able to get my head around this. If anything, I think that vocational education should require more educational expertise, not less. After all, we are often working with incredibly diverse cohorts. We're supporting learners with vastly different educational backgrounds, different levels of literacy, numeracy, digital skills, different levels of confidence, different motivations, and different experiences of education and life. We're asking people to develop skills and knowledge and judgment, problem solving skills, workplace capability, often in really compressed time frames. Now, why on earth would that require less educational expertise? And the more I've thought about it, the more I've come to believe that one of the defining characteristics of the Australian vet sector is the absence of educational voices in many of the decisions that shape the sector. And I'm not just talking about trainers and assessors here. I'm talking about managers, consultants, resource developers, RTO owners, boards, regulators, policymakers. It's across the entire system. Now, what often fills that vacuum is industry expertise. And now, before the pitchforks get sharpened again, I'm absolutely not arguing against industry expertise, because industry expertise is critical. Vocational education without industry expertise would be absolutely absurd. Our industry experts are the ones that help us to understand what competence looks like in the real world. The problem is that industry expertise and educational expertise aren't the same thing. Knowing how to do something isn't the same as knowing how to teach somebody else how to do it. Knowing how to perform a task isn't the same as knowing how people develop capability. Knowing what competence looks like in the workplace isn't the same as knowing how to assess competence effectively. And yet, for years, I've watched these two forms of expertise get blended together as though they're interchangeable. And the result is that educational questions often get answered by people whose expertise lies somewhere else. Now, for a moment, just imagine doing that in any other profession. Imagine saying to an engineer, we don't really need engineering expertise because we've got some people who actually use bridges. Imagine saying to a doctor, we don't really need medical expertise because we've all been to the doctor before. It's ridiculous, right? Yet in vets, educational expertise is often treated as optional. And that has consequences. In fact, I think it explains a hell of a lot. One of the things that I've observed over the years is that many people entering the sector have only ever experienced the vet sector, aside from compulsory schooling, of course. And often they haven't had great experiences of their compulsory schooling. They were trained in vet. They then became trainers in it. Then perhaps they became managers within vet. Their understanding of quality educational practice has been shaped entirely by what they've seen around them. Now, that doesn't make them bad practitioners, and it doesn't mean they don't care, but it does mean that many assumptions go unquestioned. In fact, I'll share with you a conversation that I've had, more times than I can count. I'll be working with a trainer or a training team, and we'll be talking about ways to improve, learning activity, a session, a unit training plan, interactivity. And often in these conversations, I'll suggest, introducing things like, scaffolding or more opportunities for practice, different ways that we can engage learners. And very often the response isn't that won't work because X, Y, Z, and there's a substantial reason as to why it won't work. The response is often rooted in, well, I didn't learn it that way. That's just not how you learn this. And it's fascinating when you actually stop and think about it. Not because there's anything wrong with that person or the people giving that feedback, right? In fact, many of the people who say this are highly experienced, highly capable professionals who really care deeply about their learners. But embedded within that response is a really powerful assumption. The assumption is that because I learned a particular way, that's therefore the way that learning should happen. Nobody stops to ask whether it was actually a good learning experience. Nobody asks whether they struggled unnecessarily. Nobody asks whether they retained the knowledge effectively. Nobody asks whether there might have been a better approach. The benchmark becomes personal experience rather than educational evidence. Now imagine if we applied that logic anywhere else. I don't use that piece of technology because I didn't learn with it. I don't use that medical procedure because it wasn't around when I trained. I don't use that engineering technique because that's not what I learnt 30 years ago. We recognize that professions evolve. They draw on research. They draw on evidence. They refine their practice over time. Yet, in vet, I often see people defending a practice simply because it's familiar. And I think that's where the cycle perpetuates itself. Because if every generation of trainers trains, the way that they were taught/trained, assesses the way that they were assessed, designs learning the way that learning was designed for them, how does the system ever improve and evolve? How does new knowledge enter the system? How do advances in our understanding of learning make their way into practice? Right? A lot of the time they don't. They often hit a wall called, well, that's not how I learnt. And I think that's one of the clearest examples of what I mean by intergenerational inheritance. We inherit practices, assumptions, and beliefs from the generation before us, often without ever stopping to ask whether they're actually serving learners particularly well. If every assessment you've ever seen looks a certain way, then you start to assume that that's what assessment should look like. If every training session you've ever attended follows a particular format, then you start to assume that that's what good training looks like. If every learning resource you've ever used has been designed in a particular way, then you start to assume that's the standard. And I think it's one of the reasons that the sector struggles to improve. And I mean in terms of improving quality, not because people don't want to, but because improvement becomes really difficult when you've never been exposed to alternatives. And I've seen this countless times when I've been talking to vet professionals, vet practitioners, about concepts from educational research. Things that are completely uncontroversial in a broader education sense, in broader education circles, can really be met with resistance in vet. And I think that's because they challenge long held assumptions. Now, the irony is that many of the things we struggle with as a sector have already been explored extensively in other educational contexts. Learner engagement, motivation, assessment validity, feedback, knowledge and skill retention, cognitive overload, transferable skills. These aren't new concepts. The education profession has spent decades, sometimes even centuries, researching them. Yet sometimes vet behaves as though we're the first people to encounter these sorts of challenges. And I think that's partly because we've spent so long prioritizing industry expertise that we've forgotten the value of educational expertise. And again, I'm not suggesting here that one's more important than the other. I'm suggesting that we need both. The best trainers I've ever worked with have had both. They understood their industry deeply and they understood how people learn effectively. The best leaders I've worked with have had both. They understood the business realities because, RTOs are businesses, but they also understood educational quality. So ask yourself this: when was the last time your RTO deliberately sought educational expertise? Not compliance expertise, not regulatory expertise, and not industry expertise. Educational expertise. Because if we're absolutely honest, many of the challenges we're currently facing as a sector aren't really compliance problems. Compliance is just where the symptoms show up. The deeper issue is that we've spent decades undervaluing the profession that sits at the heart of what we actually do. We are an education sector, and it's time we started acting like one. I genuinely think that if we brought more educational voices into the room, more educational thinking into our decision making, and more educational expertise into leadership positions and leadership conversations, then many of the issues we're currently trying to solve would start looking very different very quickly. And, I'm sure that for many people that's an uncomfortable thought, but after more than a decade in the sector, it's something that I've become increasingly convinced of.